Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. It's always difficult as a TV anchor to be interviewing or moderating a discussion with somebody who's been described as a wordsmith. Is it true that Prepone got attested to your name?
Actually, no. It's a nice thing to say. I briefly thought it might be. So I floated the query out in public, and I got a very helpful response from the Oxford English Dictionary, saying that though it had not been in common use, somebody in 1914 had used it in a letter in the New York Times or something, and somebody in 1950 had used it in a government document. So I can't claim, since both those dates were before I was born, I can't claim to have originated it. But I'm happy to put it back into circulation in India sometime in the 70s.
All right, so let's start with the G20 presidency. This is the year of India's G20 presidency. I believe that over 100 G20 meetings have happened in the course of the last 1 year during India's presidency. How do you see India seizing this moment? Is it a sort of an announcement that India has arrived on the world stage, much like, let's say, the Beijing Olympics was for China?
No, it's actually been quite remarkable because, to begin with, none of us expected this. The G20 chairmanship rotates, and it rotates every year. We might even have had it the previous year, but we swapped with Indonesia, so we got it this year. But what India did brilliantly, I think, was to, as you say, take it to the people, not just 100, I think it's more like 200 meetings, 58 cities, 32 work streams. So they suddenly made the G20 a kind of buzzword in India in a way that other countries that have hosted G20 meetings had failed to do. So full credit to India for seizing the opportunity, sort of pushing it as a kind of people's G20 by involving youth groups and civil society groups and think tanks. All of that's happened. And definitely it has, put India sort of on the consciousness of these 20 countries and their senior officials and ministers beyond any shadow of a doubt. And I think that's been quite remarkable. I think in many ways for India, it's one more sort of aspect of our soft power. You can take people to Hampi and to Srinagar and you showcase our diversity, you showcase so many aspects of our rich culture and so on. That helps. And to my mind, I've been a long advocate of soft power as India's strength, and I think this was one very good example of it.
Let's talk about hard power. I was there in the US when the Prime Minister visited a few weeks back. We had the recent visit to France, all the defense deals, the big tech deals. Do you see a sense in global capitals that they see India as the country to take a long bet on?
Oh yeah, I don't think that anyone feels they can afford to ignore India. That's out of the question. That's been evolving since the beginning of the century. And I would say that what's interesting is that it straddled both parties in our system and all governments in major countries. In other words, of course, Russia's only had Mr. Putin, but if you look at America, they've had Republican and Democratic presidents. We've had in France a series of different administrations. But right across, there's been the sense that India is a force to be reckoned with on the world stage, a country that must be taken seriously. And I think that the government has done well to work assiduously at it and take this up. I should preface this by saying that, to be honest, right from the days when I used to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, I took the line that there is no such thing as a BJP foreign policy or a Congress foreign policy. There's only India's foreign policy and India's national interests. And when it comes to our place in the world, we are all Indians, and I see it that way. So I want to stress to begin with that I'm not sort of suddenly turning out to be a lovey-dovey voice, but on foreign policy, I think by and large, and I used to be a critic at the beginning of the Modi administration of some of their failings, but I think they've really touched all the bases reasonably well. I mean, I remember the first year of Mr. Modi's prime ministership, he traveled to 27 countries, and not one of them was an Islamic country, and I made a bit of a fuss about that as a Congress MP and as a voice in the public space, and I'm delighted to say that what he's done subsequently in outreach to the Islamic world has been exemplary. In fact, it could not be bettered. We have outstanding relations with major Muslim countries, particularly in the Gulf, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And that's something which I think is to the credit of India and of the government. So I'm not going to take that. I'm happy to take back my earlier criticism.
Okay, but there are challenges therein as well, and the biggest seems to be China. What would the Congress have done differently with clearly a big power a bigger economic power, a bigger military power, that is hell-bent on changing the status quo, forcibly that too.
Sure, but there's something there, Zaka, that we part company. When it comes to national security, we're all one. And I don't think anyone would have any difference of view on that. What we were not happy about was the Prime Minister seemingly giving the Chinese a free pass by saying that they haven't taken any Indian territory, because our concern is there was basically an unspoken modus vivendi for the last almost half a century, going back to the last shot fired in anger on the border was in 1976. Thereafter, look, I claim my borders up to there, you claim your borders up to here, so you patrol here on Monday and I patrol there on Tuesday, and we keep it going. I'm only partially making light of it, but that was more or less the way it worked. There was no shot fired in anger, there were very few incidents of guns being pointed at each other. We had worked it out. What happened then after was that the Chinese came into this space and occupied it with enduring structures, took over places, essentially made patrolling we had been doing all the way up to April, May of 2020 impossible for our army. Now that's, whether it's technically Indian territory or still disputed territory that they've occupied, is a different issue. Our Prime Minister, we felt, should not have given the Chinese a free pass on that. That's one area on which the Congress was critical. A second concern we have is, there's a number of places that are not entirely comfortable right across the LAC. We've talked about Ladakh mainly because that's where the 20 Jawans were killed, but you go all the way up to Arunachal. Now what you're seeing is there are a number of points which we used to patrol which are no longer accessible to us. In Ladakh, there was this paper that came out that the government quickly disowned, which said by senior police officers in the area that 26 out of 65 patrolling points are no longer accessible to our folks. That's bad news. Now, I understand that our business community wants to import Chinese goods. Our manufacturers feel that China has a lot to offer us that we can't do without. But that on the one hand, we go around doing something frankly rather tokenistic like banning 58 Chinese apps, a slap on the wrist. And we don't do anything about the extraordinary dependence we have on China for imports, which continue to grow. The trade deficit between our two countries is over $90 billion in China's favor. And trade went as high as $139 billion last year. There's something about that that isn't right. Whether the government has failed to help businesses recalibrate their needs, whether simply they have not explored enough alternatives, or whether they basically accepted that they have no choice but to live with China, it doesn't send a particularly healthy signal. Foreign Minister Jaishankar has very clearly said we can't have normal relations until the status quo ante is restored on the border. But there's been absolutely no move by China to come back to what the status quo was before the tragic events of 2020. And since they're not going to do that, what is our posture? Why is it that the government won't discuss this in Parliament? Why won't they take the nation into confidence as to what our constraints are, what our vision is, how we hope to move forward? There are, frankly, 20 deaths that the government still is accountable for, and it needs to find some answers.
All right, let's talk a little bit domestic politics as well. All roads today seem to be leading to Bangalore. There's the big opposition meeting, unity meeting, and so on. To explain this to our viewers, imagine this is a hall of people who are your potential voters. Why would they vote for a ragtag bunch of about 20-odd parties with no declared face and whose unity very much is in question?
Well, first of all, no one's voting for all 20 parties. The point is precisely that they should come and find common ground, perhaps a common minimum program one day, and so on. But the idea would be that where some parties are particularly strong, theirs would be the face that's presented to the electors in their states, and in other states others would be, in order not to divide the vote. So the logic was excessively simple. Some analysts saying, well, BJP won a majority with 37% of the vote, the rest of us have 63, therefore with 63 we can defeat 37 and be united. But in our system it doesn't work that way because each parliamentary seat is what you got to count. And from the BJP's 303, I believe there were only 48 seats which the two top opposition parties could have defeated the BJP in if they had not been dividing each other's votes. So that's only part of the answer. But the other part is that if we're going to put up a formidable fight, we need to actually have the capacity to put forward strong faces. And each strong face becomes undermined if within the opposition we're busy cutting them down.
Each other.
So that's the real argument. I mean, beyond that, I'm not in Bangalore, I wasn't in Patna, and I can't tell you what the discussions are. I do know that I heard from everyone who was at Patna that the atmosphere was fantastic, that there was a tremendous sense of a common cause, and of course, in Bangalore there'll even be a couple more parties who weren't there, and I'm certainly hoping that coming out of this, we'll have a clear sense of purpose and direction for the country.
Tell me this, Dr. Tharoor. I mean, yeah, while in principle it sounds like a great idea, you have 543 constituencies, even if, let's say, in 300 of those, you're able to find one joint opposition candidate to take on a BJP candidate. But practically, how will this work? Explain this to me, for example, in a state like yours. Are you going to have some kind of understanding with the left parties? It's always LDF versus
Unlikely.
UDF.
Unlikely because, of course, the history of the state is such that the rivalry between the CPM-led LDF and the Congress-led UDF is so fundamental, I mean, so almost existential, that you're not going to see any meeting of minds. But in Kerala, it's not that big a worry because the BJP is not a significant player. There are only about 3 constituencies, if I remember right, maybe 4, where they came second last time, and none where they were exceptionally close. So I think we'd have to recognize that it's a no-cost rivalry. And there's a great example of 2004 when the CPM drubbed the Congress. In fact, they won almost all the seats in Kerala and Congress came out as 0 MPs. But when they showed up in Delhi, they supported the formation of the UPA-1 government from the outside, but still that was there. So I think that you have to understand that there is a difference, both for the political parties and for the voters, between state rivalries and national. So at the state level, you will have people saying our old rivalries remain, and at the national level you'll cooperate. But there may be some states where they can overcome those distinctions.
So I'll get one question in before we open it up to the audience, and I'm sure there are a lot of audience members who are keen and eager to ask you questions. Just in terms of, what's happened in this whole project opposition unity, just what's happened in Maharashtra over the last few weeks, that is a body blow, wouldn't you say? That in Maharashtra you had this 3-party alliance, you lost power, and now both of those parties, 2 out of those 3 parties, there's a vertical split.
Yes, but I suspect it's going to be rather short-lived in terms of its impact, because ultimately the voters will be the ones deciding. And I suspect that a fair amount of voters have been turned off by the blatant cynicism involved in these exercises. We saw a similar change in Karnataka, where essentially an election which, frankly, the other side had lost was turned around through Operation Lotus, which often is a code name for naked money power. And a government was formed by the BJP, which was then rejected by the voters at the first opportunity. It could happen the same way in Maharashtra. And obviously, none of us can predict, but my argument would be that I don't think people can afford to be too complacent. In the short term, you can buy people and form a government. In the long term, you can't buy millions of voters, so we'll have to see what the voters decide. All
right. Let's open this up to our guests. My colleague Sharon is there with the mic. So I see the lady there in the...
Yes. So a lot of women requests are coming. So I'll start with...
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Who is the leader of the opposition? Who's the face?
Well, each party has its own leader.
I'm talking about Congress.
Oh, in the Congress, as you know, the president of the party is Mr. Kharge, and sort of the, what shall we say, the sort of leading figure in the party is Rahul Gandhi. Of that, there's very little doubt. The chairperson of the Parliamentary Alliance is Sonia Gandhi. All that exists. But if you mean this from the point of view of what face would be presented to the nation in the election of 24, I think the short answer that I'm inclined to give right now is, first of all, that hasn't been decided. The parties will have to get together and decide if they wish to put forward one face or not. My guesswork is not, because one of the great slogans the Congress party came up with in the 2014 election was about the simple message, "Main nahi, hum." And we've seen for 10 years a politics of main, which honestly a more credible answer can be hum. Here's a bunch of collective leaders coming together in order to present themselves to the nation, saying we'll work together to solve your problems, rather than one person saying I'm the white knight on the stallion who's going to cut through all the Gordian knots and solve all your problems, because that hasn't always worked very well, judging by unemployment, inflation, and many other challenges.
But the Congress party's white knight, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, is a disqualified MP, and unless he gets his
Well,
conviction
it's still
stayed,
pending before the Supreme Court. Let's see how that goes.
but you're hopeful he'll be able to contest the next election.
I am, because, you know, it's quite an unusual situation, Zaka, that you have an MP disqualified for 2 years, which happens to be the only case of anyone being disqualified for 2 years of criminal defamation since 1947, and 2 years conveniently happens to be the minimum period required to disqualify you from Parliament. So there's something here that really, frankly, doesn't smell right, and I think the Supreme Court will look at this very carefully.
All right.
Yeah, one more
the
question.
gentleman there in the white shirt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tharoor. I find that your first two answers on G20 and the foreign policy, I don't think any Congress will answer this way, the way you have applauded the policies in this regard, which makes you different from the other congressmen. And that takes me to my second question, that with your intellect and all, then how can you support a party who has a secret alliance with China, and even the top party functionaries don't know what are the clauses of the treaty with China, number one. Number two, you support a party whose very senior leader from your state only goes to Pakistan and seeks the support of Pakistan in dislodging a prime minister democratically elected in the country.
All right, sir, can we keep it to one question? Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid neither of those propositions entirely stands up. I mean, there's no agreement between the Congress party, as far as I'm aware, and China. There was an agreement, I believe, according to the media, because I wasn't aware of it, of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, which, as a think tank, is entitled to receive support and agreements from any outside group it can. And that, I believe, is all that happened. On the second one, I have no recollection of any leader from my state going to Pakistan, or indeed any Congress leader doing that and seeking help. Now, if you're referring to my good friend from a neighboring state, Manishankar Iyer, going to Pakistan, I don't think that what you're describing as what he asked for is at all what happened. So let's not blow these things out of proportion. I think, you know, one of the sad things about this line of questioning, if I may say so, is it goes exactly in the opposite direction from what I said in my first two answers to Zaka. Let's face it, the bipartisanship is a useful asset in our country, in our democracy. We must have differences of opinion that rest on our different views of a better society. But the moment we reduce this opposition to people being anti-national and going to enemy countries and attacking, that kind of discourse just destroys. We are all patriots. We are all in this to create better India in our own lives.
All right. Thank you. No engagement. Yeah, the lady here in the white sari.
Sir, I am Navratan Chaudhary, an advocate. So you will believe this, along with me, that for a strong democracy, a very stronger opposition is very, very necessary to work it properly.
I agree.
So, and you belong to a party, the oldest party of India. So, where are you failing is my one question. The second is, please, no offense to this question at all. Do you see India as being taken towards communism?
To be taken
Communism.
Taken towards
No,
communism.
I don't see that. I don't see that. In fact, if anything, communism is now the ideology, in theory, of only one state government, and it doesn't practice it. So I don't think we can really worry too much about that. I do want to say, however, that, that on the broader issue of needing a strong opposition, to be honest, I think the government also has a responsibility to facilitate the conditions in which our opposition can flourish. We have seen far too many efforts to undermine opposition functioning in our country in ways that are not healthy for our democracy. I'm not suggesting that things were perfect before, but they can be improved rather than worsened. One of the things I've suggested, for example, for quite some time now, is that we could take a leaf out of other democracies and allot one day a week in Parliament for the opposition to set the agenda. That will remove any incentive for anyone to disrupt, because the fact is they will be able to raise their issues. It's when they try and discuss issues the government doesn't want to discuss, and the government's the only one entitled to set the agenda, that's when disruption and so on happens. So I would urge that we try and find creative ways of involving the opposition in the governance of the country. It would be healthy for the democracy, whoever is in opposition and whoever is in government.
All right, thank you very much.
Dr.
All right,
Tharoor.
I think Aman will take the last question.
The last question, that the opposition unity which we are speaking about, we've seen this meeting in Bangalore, such opposition unity has hardly worked in a Lok Sabha election against Mr. Modi. It has worked to a certain extent in some state elections. But when it comes to the Lok Sabha election, we see people voting more for Mr. Modi rather than maybe I would say even the BJP. Do you think what the opposition lacks is a plan, a Modi plan, for example? It does have a plan for other things. It doesn't seem to have a Modi plan.
Well, I think you may be right. There is an increasing perception that people are now voting on a personality-based basis. And we've seen this in some state elections. Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu was larger than any of her candidates, Mamta in Bengal similarly, and so on. But it's not universally true. There are many states where the voters have not gone on that basis. Now, it may well be that the BJP feels their biggest electoral asset is the charisma of the Prime Minister, and that's for the BJP to do. We will probably find other ways of approaching the problem. For example, the problems that affect the ordinary daily lives of our citizens, like unemployment, like price rise. People who voted for the BJP 10 years ago expecting they'd get jobs in a booming economy, and they still don't have a job, we'll tell them, why do you want to vote for these guys again merely because you like somebody's face? You can see, I think, a basis for a constructive opposition that is not necessarily personality-centered.
All right, and finally, since you're a cricket buff, we have to ask you a cricket question.
Okay.
Given our travails both in the Indian team, both in Test cricket and in T20, what hopes do you have for the upcoming one-day World Cup, which incidentally is...
First of all, we don't really have travails, man. We came two successive finals of the World Test Championship.
But we lost.
We lost, fair enough. But we're right now sort of showing our utter dominance over the West Indies this week and next. I do feel that we shouldn't exaggerate how badly we're doing. But on the ODI World Cup in India, the last time it was held in India, we won the tournament. So I'm certainly hoping that we'll be able to manage a repeat.
All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks
Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor and Zagar, for that very engaging conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for Dr. Shashi Tharoor.